Zoe Milgrom, welcome to Project 100.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Um, yeah, I see you're the Chief Clinical Officer and Genetic Counselor at, I think it's your own business, isn't it?
Yeah, so I co-founded
Yes,
Eugene back in 2018.
Eugene Labs, as in Eugene, the person's name.
Yeah, it's spelt Eugene as in the person's name.
Where did Eugene come from? Or has that come from is that a derivation of Evgeny or something like that? Some sort of being like a Greek word for joy, etc.?
No, so Eugene is all about delivering medical grade genetic testing at scale. And so we wanted to really humanize the company and maintain that real one-to-one connection that we have with people in delivering informed health insights to them through genetic information. So, like lots of startups, single names are fun. Gene is at the end, and Eugene is a play on your gene or Eugene.
Yeah, and also at the same time as a person's name. So sort of
Exactly.
it's friendly. So maybe you could
Exactly.
just give me a little bit of background on yourself. You're obviously educated in terms of genetic counseling, etc. But maybe just for our audience, just tell us a little bit about your personal background.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Zoe Milgrom. I grew up in Melbourne, but I've lived in different states and around the world. I trained as a genetic counselor back in 2006, and a genetic counselor is essentially an allied health professional that aims to empower people by helping support them and their understanding around how genetics influences their health, their reproductive or personal health risks. And so my background was I've done lots of different uni courses, but a Bachelor of Behavioral Neuroscience with majors in psychology, neuroscience, and human genetics. I then went on and completed a Masters of Genetic Counselling, which is the qualification required for Australian genetic counsellors to practice in the field. And my first role was actually in a high risk obstetrics and pediatric setting. And during those 5 early years, I think they were incredibly formative. I saw a huge amount of rare diseases, but more so, I saw how those conditions impacted the people who were affected by those conditions, and not only the person who was diagnosed with that genetic condition, but their families and their communities and their networks. And I delivered a huge amount of bad news. And early on, genetics was incredibly expensive. There are a huge number of barriers to accessing care. And often we were using genetics in the form of diagnostic testing, so helping to identify the genetic cause of a condition that was already present and impacting a person. And for me, genetic counselling was always an incredibly personal and intimate conversation. Often there was a lot of crisis counselling involved and a lot of personal values and beliefs sort of being intertwined with scientific and genetic information. And I think what really prompted me to want to found Eugene was after having my own family and noticing and seeing the drop in the cost of genetic testing and the increase in clinical utility of that testing. I really didn't want to deliver bad news forever. And I wanted to really empower more people to access genomic testing to predict and prevent disease. So most genetic counsellors work within a public tertiary hospital setting, and there are about 400 genetic counsellors practicing in Australia today. And they probably see 2 to 3% of the population. And that's really for diagnostic or predictive testing. But what I want to see as a future for genetics is that it's really truly accessible to people at the moments in their life that it matters. And so Eugene is all about delivering genomics to people wherever they are at and helping them access medical grade genetic testing so that they can make actionable insights and make really critical important medical decisions, whether it be for pregnancy planning or their own health. And so I think for me, my journey has been founded in seeing the true human impact of genetic conditions, but also really wanting to open the aperture and open the conversation around genetics and in a way switch that conversation from people having a negative relationship with genetic variation to seeing it as an empowering piece of information that people can then leverage to improve their health outcomes.
And before we talk about genetic testing and accessibility,
Yeah.
that accessibility that you just talked about being more available to every Australian.
Mm.
If I could just touch on genetic counselling for a moment. Excuse me. My only experience with this was when I decided to get genetic testing for some brain diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Mostly it was done through a lab, but it was obviously, but it was mostly for MND, um, or yeah, ALS, MND, um,
Mm.
dementia, which for some reason worries me all the time, and
Mm.
uh, and or Parkinson's, because
Yeah,
and the reason why I decided to have that is because when my mother passed away from neuron disease.
I'm
I've
sorry to hear that.
copped Thank you. I've copped a lot of punches in the head as a result of too long in the boxing ring. So I get worried about dementia, which is probably most guys and girls who've been in the physical contact sports probably worry about that, because
Mm.
we would all know somebody who, who's a contemporary of ours, that has got early onset. And in terms of Parkinson's, because I knew a really good friend of mine who got Parkinson's, and I thought, well, I must get tested for that. Anyway, point being, I had, before I was allowed to do that, I had to get counselling. Maybe you could explain why it was, like, I think it was mandatory. I don't think I was allowed to have the test
Mm.
until I had the counselling. And some of the tests that I was getting, some of the tests for those particular items I just mentioned to you, was done through the Garvan Institute here at St Vincent's, or next door to St Vincent's.
Yep.
And so that counselling process actually, for me, it was a brand new experience. I So why is it mandatory, or why is it advisable that we get genetic counselling? Counselling being, yeah, it's not the genetic test; it's the counselling around perhaps what you might find out, Mark. I think. But what is that about?
Yeah, I love that you brought up this question because it's my favorite thing to talk about, and I'll try and limit it to not keeping you here all day. But genetic counseling all is about translating the complexities of science and genetics into tangible information that can help people understand how an actual test result on paper will actually potentially influence how they perceive themselves, how they evaluate their own risks in life, how they fit within the context of their family and their community. And I think for a lot of people, we just assume that we are who we are because of the genes that we inherited from our parents. And for much of monogenic genetics, that is actually the case. And I think genetic counselling is all about creating space in a person's life to stop and reflect on what has motivated them to get to the point of wanting to pursue testing. So, understanding what the motivations of that person are and what the expected or hoped outcomes of that test might be. When we provide genetic counselling, we try and limit the technical jargon and create analogies that I guess reflect that own person's experience. So I often talk about genes as recipes or as building blocks. Engineers really love data, so obviously statistics tend to play a big factor in those conversations. But really, what we're trying to do is prepare that person for a potential result which they can't change, which will certainly have an implication on how they perceive themselves and how they make potential medical decisions or lifestyle changes based on those results. And so we really, really try to mirror the language, both the verbal language and the body language of a person, to make them feel heard, understood, and cared for. Because anyone I feel who decides to have a genetic test is open to a level of vulnerability about themselves, about finding out information about themselves. And so genetic counselling is all about taking the time to talk about the probabilities, the potential outcomes, the benefits, but also the limitations of genetic tests. So, no two genetic tests are the same. No genetic test can identify all risks or reduce or remove all risks. And so, genetic counselling is all about really establishing almost a contract with the person that you're sitting with, that you will be there to support them, to empower and advocate for them on their healthcare journey, but also to support them emotionally, physically, and psychosocially in terms of what those results might look like. And with any sort of predictive or diagnostic or even screening test, we think it's really important that people understand those factors so that they can ultimately make an informed decision and be prepared for whatever the outcome might be. So, not all genetic testings require genetic counselling, and certainly there's a whole concept around mainstreaming of genomics. But as a genetic counsellor, I definitely see the benefits in the long-term health outcomes and adaptations that people tend to make in terms of their behaviours and actions when that preparation has occurred, and then that continuity of care can be established around the delivery of those results as well.
So is genetic counselling, maybe an example that I gave you, is it more about me understanding the risks of finding out about what my genes might be telling me, or the genome testing in relation to me might be telling me? In other words, assisting me to de-risk my life relative to what the finding is? Or is it more about making sure that I don't go loopy as a result of finding out that I might have some sort of variation or some mutation that has a correlation to, in the example I gave you, to say getting dementia?
Mm. So I think genetic counselling is actually about both. It's about supporting that person to understand and consider how they might react to a certain result, but also ensuring that they've got the support networks around them to support them regardless of the outcome. So much like the story that you shared about your experience, you're coming in possibly as a healthy person who we might call someone who is of the worried well. So they've got an acute awareness of potential risks, and they're wanting to try and understand whether those risks are relevant to them, and hopefully, if we do find something, what actions they can take to reduce or mitigate that risk. So it's a little bit of both.
So, and now your new business, Eugene Labs, that is not just counselling, but that is actually genome testing.
Yeah, so
It's both. It's beyond what you were doing in a professional sense, but it's actually making genome testing more accessible,
yeah,
cheaper, easier. Which one?
all of the things. So Eugene is all about delivering end-to-end medical grade clinical insights and partnering that with expert genetic counselling so that anyone in our community can access a medical grade genetic test either to help inform their pregnancy plans or their potentially adult onset risk of cancer or cardiac disease, and ensuring that they understand how those results could implement their medical management or their reproductive decision making. So, Eugene is all about improving accessibility, trying to reduce the costs as much as we can, trying to increase access. So we don't mind whether you're sitting in a building, you're in your office in inner city Sydney, or on a farm in the middle of Australia. You should be able to access the clinical care that you need to make informed decisions about proactive genetic testing. And we're very much about improving literacy around genetics as well, and also acknowledging that genetics is moving from a reactive or diagnostic setting to a proactive and predictive setting. And in order to be able to deliver that to the entire population, we need to deliver and build technology that enables us to scale the clinical services that we need to support that increased appetite for testing.
So accessibility. We'll talk about affordability in a second, but
Yeah.
because I know the one I had was very expensive, relatively speaking. But if we talk about accessibility,
Yeah.
and literacy also is an important part of that. But accessibility means you would draw the blood, perhaps, I'm just second guessing here,
Yeah.
from my office, so I don't have to go to the Garvan Institute or some other pathology place. Or I might be a regional person, I might be living in wherever, in the regions, and perhaps you could even come to my home and or whatever. Is that what we're talking about?
Oh, we've made it even easier than that. So all of our genetic tests only require a buccal swab, which is essentially like a saliva sample. So it's
Wow.
as simple as logging onto our website, reading about the different tests, products, and services that we offer, choosing the one that aligns with your goals, and then buying that. And then we ship you a kit to your home. So it's as simple as that. And genetic counselling is provided much like I'm talking to you today. Generally, we see people who are calling in from home, which means that from a barriers perspective, people generally feel a lot more comfortable being vulnerable and talking about genetic testing in their own homes. And also, essentially, we have quite a lot of flexibility throughout the day, so people aren't having to make excuses to leave work. They can either log in before or after hours or even during the day. So accessibility is not only about physical accessibility, but also meeting people where they're at.
So is the counselling side of it, before I take the test, I swab the inside of my cheek, or is it, and or it could be, help me interpret the results as well? Where's the counselling fit in?
Yeah, so the counselling bookends the testing experience. So at Eugene, we try and I provide asynchronous care. So a person can log in, learn about the benefits, limitations, likely outcomes of testing. We collect 3 generations of family history because family history is an essential part of considering where that person is in terms of their pre-test risk versus their post-test risk.
Sorry,
And
what does that mean? What does that mean? 3 generations? So if let's say
yeah,
I want to get something done, you say, okay, let's get mum or dad and one of your kids, or is that what you're talking about?
well, so we would ask you questions about your health, your any siblings' health, your children's health, nieces and nephews, parents, and potentially grandparents. And what we're essentially trying to draw is a pedigree that helps place you within the context of your family and your family's health history. Because you are you because of what your parents passed down to you. And of course, the same goes for your children. So perhaps if we did a test in you and we identified that you were a carrier of a specific genetic condition that put you at elevated risk, that would have implications for your blood relatives. And so helping you to understand how you fit within the context of your nuclear family can help you also empower and educate the people you love around you. And so those conversations are part of pre-test counselling. We also talk about potential implications for life insurance. There's a lot of movement in that, and we're really, really hopeful that the government will legislate against a complete ban on genetic discrimination in life insurance underwriting. I think, they're currently working on that legislation at the moment. But with genetic counselling, we're really trying to give the person the whole picture so that they go in with open eyes.
You
Um,
mean that you don't have to, your premium's not going to go up because you found something out that you need to
that
disclose?
that is the hope as where we'll end up. So there was a moratorium put in place that prevented life insurers asking about genetic test results beyond a certain level of claim cover. But the hope is that that will be completely removed. But we are waiting on the government on the legislation around that. So there are lots of
So
things to consider.
could I just ask you on that, just on that,
Yeah.
if you do a genetic test and I don't know, it's somehow says that you'll have a higher propensity to get, cardiovascular disease for
Mm-hmm.
some reason. And that, just so I understand, are we currently obliged under the disclosure requirements to tell that to our life insurance company?
So if you have life insurance in place already, you are not.
Yep.
But if you're
Right.
applying for increased cover or new cover, you may be obliged to disclose that. The hope
Right.
is, fingers crossed, by the end of the year, that will no longer be a case. But things
Okay.
take time.
Because it sort of is a discrimination if they apply a penalty to you, or
Yeah.
a penalty in terms of higher premiums.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really interesting case examples that we can chat about if you're interested in how people who are actually accessing genetic testing proactively can reduce their
Yeah,
lifetime risks.
exactly.
So uh, I think that's why the government has really really backed this ban, because the reality is that if we're going to move towards a future of precision medicine and preventative care, our government structures need to support people in pursuing those choices.
Are there any constraints for Eugene Labs and I should just spell it for anybody who's listening, is Eugene Labs, Labs. I presume it's .com.au.
Just .com.
Just .com. So if someone goes to the website and looks down the menu of what's available in terms of genetic testing, but are there any constraints in your testing portfolio of tests as a result of only doing a swab on the inside of your mouth as opposed to, say, doing a blood test? Are there things that you can't now test for?
That's
Can
a
you test
really
for everything?
So we don't test for everything. So when we think about the human genome, we think that there are about 23,000 genes that influence our health, growth, and development. We target very specific panels of genes that are associated with the most common causes of cancer, heart disease, where we know how the translation of the genetic impact, how that influences the person's lived experiences and risk. And so we have a few rules. We don't test minors. The person must order and purchase the test on their own behalf. We don't, some people might consider, oh, I want to buy this as a gift for my daughter who's just got married, but we actually have to engage with the person who's having the test. And we only test for genetic conditions where there is a medical action that can be taken from the result. So there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different genetic tests out there. At Eugene, we really want to focus on medically actionable genetic tests where where the results are clearly interpreted by geneticists and genetic counselling, and there are actions that can be taken within the current medical system. So we clearly define what we do and we don't test for. Given that we're a digital health service, and I know you touched on adult onset neurodegenerative conditions, we actually don't focus on neurodegenerative conditions. I have an honours degree in Huntington's disease which is a dominant genetic condition, and I feel quite strongly that people who have a family history or who are at risk of these conditions should be seen within a tertiary multidisciplinary centre, because there are significant risks and obviously opportunities in knowing that. But I don't currently believe that a digital format is the best way to support a person where the implications, where there isn't necessarily any medical management that can be taken.
So given, I don't know, how long have you been doing Eugene now for, Eugene Labs?
Yep. So Eugene was established in 2018, and we've seen over 30,000, I think we're at this week, over
Wow.
30,000 Australians, providing them end-to-end clinical care around either reproductive or preventative health testing.
And when you mentioned affordability, accessibility and
Mm.
affordability and probably understandability with counselling, how is affordable? How does it look affordable? So like, what are we talking about relative
Yeah.
to what was around before you guys kicked off?
So I think the reality is when we talk about the cost of genetic testing, people often liken it to Moore's law. So as an example, the sequencing of the first human genome was completed in 2003, and it cost about $2.7 billion. Um, Today, you can sequence a human genome for probably less than $500. So the leap change has been enormous, where the first genome took 13 years to complete. It included numerous research teams across the world, hundreds and hundreds of researchers. These days, you can sequence a human genome within a couple of hours or days. And so the utility and the turnarounds are significantly different. The challenge is that the sequencing of human genomes is essentially moving towards a commodity of sorts. So anyone can sequence the DNA, but the real value lies in the analysis and the interpretation and the integration of how pathogenic variants, so that's disease causing changes in the DNA, translate into human health. And of course, the clinical care around that and the medical management in the future of that person in terms of surveillance, treatments, and hopefully in the future cures through gene therapy. So It is absolutely, at this stage, there is limited government funding for a healthy individual wanting to pursue testing. So there are significant out of pocket costs for people wanting to pursue it. But I think what has been interesting is that um, the government is really seeing the health economic value of proactive screening at a population level. So, as an example, in November of 2023, the government announced Medicare funding for reproductive carrier screening, which is a genetic test that helps parents understand their risk of having a child with a serious inherited genetic condition. Now, there are many ways to screen for that. You can test for one gene, you can test for 1,000 genes, and the cost varies depending on the number, but also the way we approach it. But in November 2023, the government announced funding for a 3-gene test, which includes conditions cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, and Fragile X. And that was really a watershed moment in our history of genetics, wherein the government said, hey, we recognize that our community wants this knowledge and we need to improve access by reducing the cost of accessing care. And so for that test, if you hold a valid Medicare card, you're of female sex, and you are planning or in the first trimester of pregnancy, that test is freely available to you. And so if you log on to eugenelabs.com, you can access a fully Medicare covered test, but you can also spend upwards of $1,000 getting much more comprehensive testing. And I think with the increased cost is increased detection rates. So that 3-gene test, if you're of Caucasian Australian ethnicity, will pick up about 20% of couples who have an underlying risk factor of having a child with a serious genetic condition. It will probably pick up closer to 10% if you're of non-Caucasian European ancestry. But when we expand those panels to hundreds of genes, we have the potential to pick up more than 90% of couples who have an underlying risk factor of having a child with a genetic condition. So there is still a user pays bias in who can access testing. But I think if we don't make it more accessible and talk about it and educate people about the differences, we're never going to get to a point where we can prove out the benefit for example, in national screening programs, which there is a huge amount of research being invested into at the moment.
Could you just explain something to me, Counsel?
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, when you take the swab and you do the analysis, and you see that, let's talk about cystic fibrosis in a
Mm-hmm.
for a mother who's going to bear a child, and
Yep.
but before they get pregnant, before the couple get pregnant, what is it that what do you see on the genes? Do you see mutation, or do you, what I mean? And is this, and do you know, is it correlation or
Yeah.
causation?
Well, it's so I'll maybe take a couple of steps back and give some context to your question. Maybe it'll be helpful. So, reproductive carrier screening, which includes cystic fibrosis, is a test that um, the medical guidelines recommend that all doctors should inform prospective parents or individuals who are currently pregnant about the availability of carrier screening. So they have a responsibility to let people know that between 2 to 3% of healthy individuals in the general population may have an increased risk of having a child impacted by a severe genetic condition. Cystic fibrosis is one of those conditions, and it is caused by changes in a gene called CFTR. And the CFTR gene is a relatively large gene. You can think of it like a recipe. And scientists know that there are over 1,000 variants or gene mutations that can impact how that gene creates a protein in the body and how it functions within the body. And so, for a woman who is planning a pregnancy, she may choose to have screening for a specific condition or choose to consider something called expanded carrier screening, which includes hundreds of genetic conditions. And what the scientists are looking for in the laboratory is a pathogenic variant. So a variation in the sequence of that DNA or in the recipe or code that impacts how that produces a protein and works in the body. And we know that about 1 in 30 Caucasian individuals or people in the general population are likely to be a healthy carrier of a genetic variation in that gene. It's only if both the reproductive mother and father carry a change in that gene where there translates to be an increased chance of having an affected pregnancy or a child impacted by that disease.
So,
So to
um,
answer your question, it is a causation.
causation, yes. So, and I
Yeah.
think what you're saying is that the genes that the two variations in the genes that you get from both mother and father,
Mm.
that creates something in the DNA that produces some sort of protein that would ultimately causes cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, so ultimately we know, sort of take us all back to year 10 biology. So we know that the human body is made of cells, and within those cells is a nucleus that contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. And on those chromosomes are the 23,000 genes plus a whole lot of other DNA that we're not quite sure what it does yet. If we're looking at one gene, we're looking at the sequence of that DNA, and we're looking for genetic variations or mutations. We try to use less loaded language, so we call them genetic variations because we know all healthy individuals probably have between 5 and 10 genetic variations that impact how specific genes function in the body. And so if we identify a couple, we're looking, every person has two copies of the cystic fibrosis or CFTR gene. Having a change in one of them makes you a healthy carrier. Everyone is a healthy carrier of something. It's just that we can't tell unless we're looking specifically at that genetic code. And it's only when both parents are carriers is there a chance that both parents pass on the variant of the gene that doesn't function properly that leads to the disease.
So this is an example of preventative screening, let's call it.
Yeah.
And let's say that um, in this genetic screening of both parents, you see that this variation exists in both parents.
Mm.
What do you? It doesn't necessarily follow that the child will be born with cystic fibrosis. It's more a probability
Right.
issue, isn't it? It's just a greater
Yeah.
probability.
Yeah, so when we know that both parents are carriers of the same condition, there's a 25% chance that that child will inherit two copies that don't function in the way we expect and be at risk of developing symptoms related to the disease. There's also a 25% chance that they won't inherit any of the copies with a variation and they will not be a carrier and they will not be at risk of the disease. And then there's a 50% chance that they will be a healthy carrier like their parent. And so having genetic counselling around these results and talking about how that gene variation translates into a clinical picture and lived experience of a potential person helps the parents decide whether they want to act on that information or not. And there are a number of ways that people can use that information to prevent that disease impacting the health outcomes of a child if they want.
So that particular test is one of the tests that the government don't mind subsidising. But you mentioned
Correct.
there's hundreds of other tests that these two prospective parents can have, for which they pay
Mm-hmm.
more money for.
Yes.
What right now? And I'll go on to proactive health in a moment because it's
Yeah.
probably where I'm most interested at the moment. But just looking at preventative screening in relation to reproductive genetics,
Yeah.
what are the sort of things that are proving, at least in your case, Eugene Labs case, um,
Yeah.
what proving, let's call it popular. I know popular is not a good word.
As in that we see often.
More often, yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a huge amount of research onto the genetic prevalence of conditions. And there are some conditions which are more prevalent in specific ethnic communities. But the challenge is that individually inherited genetic conditions are really rare. So As an example, with cystic fibrosis, 1 in 30 people are likely to be a carrier. And when that translates out into the math, there's about a 1 in 2,500 chance that you could have a child born with that condition. We know that when we combine hundreds of rare genetic conditions together, they're approximately, back of the napkin maths, about 6 times more likely to impact the health outcomes of a pregnancy than Down syndrome. Yet the number of people having screening for Down syndrome or other major chromosome problems is almost 100%, whereas the uptake of carrier screening prior to the rebate was probably only about 10% of people. Since the rebate has been announced, that's growing steadily, and we expect it to level out at about 60% of couples choosing to pursue testing. And so the awareness and the availability and the normalization of it as a part of pregnancy planning is incredibly important, because genetic testing should always be a choice, but in order to make an informed choice, you need to have access to the information. And so if a couple are found to be at increased risk, they can consider testing of an already established pregnancy through diagnostic prenatal testing, or they could consider utilizing IVF technologies to actually test the embryo prior to it being transferred back to the mother's uterus.
Oh,
And there's
really?
even Medicare funding for that. That's called pre-implantation genetic testing.
So,
So there's a
so
huge amount.
well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. So they can
Yeah.
actually have, using IVF, they can actually have the embryo pre-tested
Mm,
for the genetic variation being passed
that
on by
they are
both
at risk
parents.
of.
And is it just being tested for having a greater risk, or is the embryo already um, uh, I don't know what the word is, but is the
Its
already
genetic fate has been decided, I
has
guess you
it's
could
already been
think.
decided?
Yeah, from the moment that egg and sperm come together, that embryo contains the genetic recipes, 50% theoretically from the mum and from the dad, and we can determine whether they're at risk of a specific disease, but we need to know about that risk in advance to look for it, whether they're a healthy carrier like the parent or whether they're not affected at all. And in the context of IVF, we would only transfer back embryos that are not affected by the condition, essentially giving the parents the best chance of a healthy pregnancy outcome.
And do you get I don't know, pre-commitment men and women donors, male and female donor, biological male and female donor? Do you get people who do it before they even make commitment to themselves, to each other? In other words, look, I don't.
Like pre-marriage or
Yeah. I
pre.
like, yeah, like a checklist type thing. Like, like I know I'm just being very practical here. Like someone says, look, I
Yeah.
want to have a family. I prefer to have a family that doesn't have, ongoing issues. I want to be preventative. I'm not going to choose you unless you do the test. I'm going to do the test. You do the test as well. Is that a thing?
I mean, I think love comes first.
But you might
But
decide
in,
not. But you might
yeah,
decide not to.
in,
It might have some a different type of relationship with that particular
yeah,
individual.
I think so. Definitely in some cultures, so mandatory pre-marriage. So in Dubai, the local community are required to have genetic testing before they can be issued a marriage license. So that is
Wow.
on one extreme. In the religious Jewish community, many individuals undergo genetic carrier screening for conditions that are prevalent within that community. And if there is an arranged marriage, they won't be introduced if there's a potential high risk. But the reality is that 50% of pregnancies aren't planned. Most people get married for or choose to have children with a person they love. And as we're seeing more and more in terms of solo parents, I like to call them single empowered women or same sex couples. When we are looking at donor gametes, so people donating egg or sperm to help create families that are not theirs, um, genetic carrier screening in Australia is mandated. So it's a requirement of anyone who's choosing to pursue egg or sperm donation to help people understand what potential risks may be passed on to a child.
Very interesting. So if I could now go to proactive health,
Yeah.
as opposed to preventative, And I guess you call it preventative because that's pre the combination of two sets of
Yeah.
genes.
So
Proactive is
I think
you're already stuck with
yeah.
it. Proactive means you're already stuck
Yeah,
with
so
it.
I think we
You're
think about reproductive as just informed reproductive decision making. I think when we talk about proactive or preventative genetics, we're talking about a person who's already here
yeah.
and trying to identify whether they have any predisposition towards disease based on the genes that they've had from the moment the egg and sperm came together.
So what's really, again, I don't want to say popular, but like where's, if I was looking at the the bell curve, where is
Mm.
the most of the people sort of, where are they sitting? Are they looking at what types of disease? Are cancer? Are we talking about breast cancer,
Mm.
prostate cancer for men? What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a really good idea. Perhaps if I give you some sort of prevalence and incidence data, you
Yeah.
can start to see where the interest is. So, um, we estimated that about 170,000 people will be diagnosed with cancer last year. And we know that by the time a person is 85, almost 1 in 2 Australians will be diagnosed with cancer. Cancer is a big killer. We know in Australia that the most common cancers to impact people are skin cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, bowel and lung cancer. And we estimate that about 5 to 10% of those cancers are due to an inherited familial variation that that person has carried in their DNA for their entire life. And we estimate that among healthy individuals, about 8% of people will carry a gene change that increases their lifetime risk of developing cancer. So if we can identify or give access to those people in advance, we can drastically reduce their risk, improve their health outcomes on an individual level, and also we can reduce the cost to the government and to the community in terms of that person is going to be healthier for longer. I think if we switched to the other area that we all think about, we know heart disease is the number one killer of people, and that about 18% of Australians are living with heart disease. And it's, as I mentioned, the leading cause of death in Australia. So we really want to try and identify people who have a genetic predisposition towards heart disease, because if we know that, almost all of those people can have improved lifespan and improve health. And so almost 100% of people with a genetic predisposition can reduce their risk of a catastrophic heart event by modifying things like lifestyle choices, diet, exercise, and seeking early medical advice for screening and surveillance. And so the impact of being able to test proactively is enormous. And we estimate that about 6% of people carry a genetic variation that is associated with an increased risk of a heart condition. And so the impact is enormous. And that's definitely where the majority of people are looking to reduce risk by proactive genetic testing. And that's certainly what we offer at Eugene.
If we could just sort of move in on, zone in onto heart disease, for example, or
Mm-hmm.
atherosclerosis, I think that's what it's called, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, um, so if we zone into that, and I go onto Eugene labs.com and I look down your menu, and does it sort of say, Mark, are you interested in heart disease? You've got family problems, like some familial um, um, circumstances of heart disease. Does it then say to me, Mark, here's the 4, 10 genetic tests you can get for heart disease? Does it? What's it look like?
Yeah, so when you log on to Eugene, you generally choose your own adventure. So are you interested in reproductive genetics, or are you interested in proactive preventative genetics? You can then choose a cancer stream or a cardiac stream, a heart stream, or you can choose a general wellness, which includes both of those and an additional set of genes which are associated with common chronic conditions, blood clotting conditions, iron overload conditions. And the majority of people tend to say, well, if I'm going to be proactive, I want to know about as much as I can that is medically actionable within the healthcare environment today. And those panels are large. So there are over 60 genes that we know are associated with the most common causes of cancer. And we're targeting those because we have good translation of how those variants impacts disease surveillance and management. There are over 80 genes on the cardiac panel. And yes, some are associated with atherosclerosis. One of the conditions where there's a huge amount of research these days is in a genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, which is basically atherosclerosis, where we've got, enormously high levels of cholesterol, which is obviously the biggest risk factor for cardiac disease. I'm saying that I'm not a cardiologist. My brother is a cardiac geneticist, and he's very passionate about ensuring that we can offer at a population level the ability for people to predict familial hypercholesterolemia, because with treatment, we can reduce the risk of a catastrophic heart event enormously. So enormously that, these are the sorts of programs that the government thinks, well, is there value in investing in a national screening program? It's the number one killer. If we can predict and prevent disease and reduce those catastrophic events for our population, we're going to be much better off, not only within, an individual and family and community context, but from the government, from the community at large, from a health economic benefit standpoint. And so there's lots of things we can do, but, I think careful counselling is required to really help people understand the enormity of what's possible, but also the limitations. So no genetic test can ever eliminate risk, because we're not one dimensional. Our lifestyle, our environment, there are multitudes of things that interplay together. And I think there's a lot that we've still got to learn in that area.
So just on, is it hyper or hypocholesterolemia? Which one is it now? It's
Hyper. So hyper
hyper
is too much.
is the opposite,
Hypo is the
not enough.
opposite.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if you do have hypocholesterolemia, as indicated by the genetic test, so if you have a propensity to it, indicated by the
Mm-hmm.
genetic testing, that means you are at risk, and there's a probability that you will have a problem, which you say you can manage. But equally, even if you don't have the genetic predisposition for it, is it fair to say that it doesn't mean you won't get high cholesterol? And what is the percentage that comes about it? What's the percentage of people who get this problem that arises from genetics as opposed to, I don't know, lifestyle or some other bloody thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we think that about one, and I'm sure I'm going to get this stat wrong, but about 1 in 250 people in Australia are at risk of high cholesterol due to familial hypercholesterolemia.
Genetics.
There are to genetics, basically. We know that everyone has two copies of the specific genes involved. If you have one copy, that increases your risk of a catastrophic heart event by probably 20% higher than someone who doesn't have a genetic variation. And so the chance of a heart attack by 50 is, maybe 50% of people with this variant will have it. But we will see earlier signs of high cholesterol for that person in their earlier, 20s, 30s, 40s. If a child inherits two copies of the genes associated with this, they might start showing signs of high cholesterol in their early childhood, 5, 6, 7. If
Wow.
we can implement treatment at that age, think about the long-term impact of health outcomes for that child. And so, yes, anyone can have a high cholesterol. Diet is, a huge factor in that, but genetics is also a huge player. And if we
So
start to
basically,
think of that as a frontline test, it could really change lives.
yeah, so your Eugene Labs is where it can is actually identifying one of the risks, but it's a big risk. It doesn't necessarily, because you're okay, let's say you don't have any predisposition, doesn't mean therefore it follows that you won't get you won't die from a heart attack. You can still die from a heart attack. It's a bit like a PSA test.
Absolutely.
Just because a PSA test says that you're under the the uh, number that generally speaking is considered to be dangerous. Let's call it
Mm.
4 or something like that. It doesn't follow, therefore, that you won't get prostate cancer. You still can have prostate cancer, irrespective of it.
Exactly.
Whereas if you do a prostate count of 6, you've probably got prostate cancer. It's very
Mm.
likely you have prostate cancer. But if you've got
Yeah.
2 or 1, it doesn't follow that you don't have it. And it's an interesting thing. Therefore, people should be aware that whilst they're trying to be proactive around their health, just because their genetic test indicates to them everything looks okay, there's no predisposition based on genetics, it doesn't follow, therefore, that you're not going to get something. You also have to be really conscious of what you're doing outside of your genetics, because genetics is just one
Absolutely.
indicator. That's very interesting.
Absolutely.
And just interestingly enough, a little while ago, I had a blood test, and I got I've never seen this on the blood test before, but it said apolipoprotein E3 E4, and then it went on to say after that that 40% of, I think this is what it said by memory, 40% of those people who have dementia, and it didn't say which type of dementia, but let's call it just dementia in the broad term. 40% of those people had those two genes. Well, they're called
Mm.
alleles, and I don't know what that means, but what is that? What is that about? E3, E4, and does that mean I have a greater? And I'm not asking you to diagnose me, and I know you're not here to give
Good. I'm
advice.
not going to. I'm not an
But what is
expert
it?
in
What
this.
does E3, E4 mean? And then someone said to me, E2, 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 E3 is the one you want, and I didn't get that one. What are we talking about here? And
Okay.
this is a test you can get done.
Yeah, so this is definitely outside of my wheelhouse.
Yep,
So rather than answering the question directly, I guess I will answer the question of what is an allele.
yep,
So we know that in certain genes, there are common sorts of patterns that we see in people, and there is sometimes an association between what patterns a person has and what their risk level will stratify at. And so there's been a huge amount in the media around ApoE risk and dementia and lots of things like Alzheimer's. I think there were a couple of
yep.
famous people who brought that to the forefront. And I think really what's interesting
Chris
is
Hemsworth.
that, yes, don't need to name names, but yes, Chris brought it up.
No, he did. He
And I
brought out
think,
publicly.
yeah. So I think what's really interesting is that there's a huge amount of disease correlation when it comes to gene variations and lifetime risk of disease. Having a genetic variation is not a diagnosis. So it doesn't say, if you have a BRCA1 mutation, it's the most common gene associated with breast cancer. Having a BRCA1 gene variation doesn't mean you have breast cancer. It doesn't necessarily mean you will get breast cancer, but it does increase the chance. And therefore, from a longevity or wellness point of view, there are things as humans who are at increased risk that we can do to try and protect or reduce the risk of. And I think any genetic test that is of medical grade and has a great scientific backing means that we can then access the care that we need to feel empowered by that information rather than scared. And at Eugene, we're really passionate about ensuring that people have a positive, empowering health outcome rather than going, oh my God, I've got this and there's nothing I can do about it. So the actionability of tests is a really important thing for us to think about.
So that's a very interesting thing what you just said, because I had sort of two responses when I saw that it was a blood test, by the way, but first response was, whoa, what the hell? I remember Chris Hemsworth talking about this on that TV
Mm,
show on Netflix, and Peter Attia told him that Dr. Peter Attia told him that he had uh, these alleles, E3, E4, and then didn't sound like great news. And then I saw it for myself.
mm,
So my first reaction was, whoa, is there a problem? And then after having discussed it, I went and spoke to a friend of mine, a urologist, Dr. Matthew Kiernan from Neura, CEO at Neura, and he sort of he's not a genetic counselor, but he sort of counseled me by saying to me what you just said. It doesn't necessarily follow, by the way. Nothing follows, but it's worth knowing. And and this is a question for you, if you don't mind. How do we manage the difference between worry and empowerment
It is
as
such a
individuals? Not for,
fine line. Yeah.
if for me, the individual, not for you, the counselor, because that's your job. But what would
Mm,
you say to somebody? What do you say to me to think about? Not in a counselling sense, if you don't mind, but in a logical
mhm.
sense. Like, what's the logic
In a
behind me
logical
knowing
sense.
it? Yeah, me knowing that.
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting thing to consider because everybody will perceive their own vulnerabilities and health risks in a different way. And it's very much colored by their lived experience. So, with your lived experience that you've shared about your father's diagnosis and your sporting history and things like that, you've got a hyper awareness about potential risks. And obviously, you're really motivated and empowered to access tests to help give you information that you can then act on to improve your likely health based on the cards you've already been dealt. And as a genetic counselor, what we really want people to recognize is that a genetic result can't be changed, but the way you respond, embody that, and then respond to that is in your control. And I think that's what really sort of was alluring for me in building Eugene was I didn't want people to feel like they were sort of in control of their genetic diagnosis. So I would never say to someone, oh, that child has cystic fibrosis. I would say, hey, this is John. Something that we know about him is that his lungs get sticky because he actually has a change in one of his recipes. And I would never label someone by that because it's really important. Yes, it's part of someone's identity, and yes, it influences the decisions that they make in life. But ultimately, we are complex human beings existing in a very complex world. And there are so many things to think about, and we can't ever let a risk or a diagnosis, I guess, define who we are because ultimately we know that lifestyle modifications, medications, surgeries, they can change our risk, but only if we know about them in advance. And so the fine line between scaring and empowering is a fine line. And that's why genetic counseling in our opinion is really, really important because you want to give people the tools that they need to translate what comes out on that piece of paper and then respond to that in a way that fits within the context of their values and beliefs.
That's a very interesting point about genetic counselling, because I think when people first see the word counselling, they just expect someone's going to hold their hand and
There
you'll
is
be okay.
hand holding.
You'll be okay, Mark. Or alternatively, there could be some warnings and stuff like that. This is stuff you want to be sensitive to, etc., Mark. Except that, well, I think what you're saying too is it's a lot more than that. It's
Mm,
actually maybe directing me, Mark. Look, if you're really worried about, perhaps you should go and see a neurologist. Mark, if you're really worried about it, maybe you should see a cardiologist.
mm,
Mark, if you're really worried about this pregnancy with your partner, therefore there's some more tests that you should be getting done based on what we have seen in your family and her family. It's a much
mm.
bigger, broader picture. It seems to me that from what you've established here, Eugene Labs is really just a mechanism by which you can do more counselling. And I don't mean counselling in terms of helping people feel better. It's about actual, not advice, but guidance, proper guidance. But
Mm.
you can't
Yeah,
guide them
absolutely.
unless they've had the tests.
Yeah, so where we see Eugene is sort of like if you imagine a funnel. So we've got all the population at the top, and everyone, in our opinion, should have the opportunity to consider whether genetic testing is of value to them. We then take all of those people, offer them counselling, offer them a genetic test, and at the end, you know, between 5 and 7% of those people are going to come back with an increased risk result that is actionable within their lifestyle or healthcare choices. Most people are going to get a low risk result. For those people, they feel pretty reassured that, hey, I've done this test that I was feeling a little wobbly about, but now I feel great that I know that I've done everything I can and I can move forward with my choices, whether it be to pursue a pregnancy or, to run a marathon or to, become an Air Force pilot, that I'm not going to have an aneurysm or something unusual like that. And so I think where we see Eugene is giving people access to the information and the tests so that they can make decisions at the point in their lifetime when it feels relevant. And then, if someone does come back with an increased risk result, we ensure continuity of care by providing tertiary referrals, whether it be to a cardiologist or a familial cancer centre or a fertility specialist or an obstetrician or a pediatrician. People choose to react and use that information in different ways. And I think that's what genetic counselling is all about. It's about giving people unbiased information. Obviously, we've got a lot of experience, but helping them find a way that fits within their values and their goals. And, I think historically genetic counsellors were trained to be non-directive. But when you've got someone sitting in front of you and they say, wow, I've got a 25% risk that my baby might die from this condition that you've identified in me and my partner, what would you do? The reality is that we turn around and we say, well, what do you think you would do? What might it look like for your family in the future if you had a child with this condition? What might that condition look like? How would that change your goals and your plans for the future? Do you want to reduce that risk? Do you want to access the care of physicians to help you support bringing a child who might have those risk factors into the world? It's ultimately about choice. And if we give people, valid, trusted, transparent information, genetic counsellors can guide that person to move forward with an informed choice. And choices change over time.
Could I ask you one more question, Zoe, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
The final question is that one of the things I found out when I had my genetic testing for the conditions I mentioned to you earlier, those neurodegenerative issues, I had my test many, many years ago. When I say many years ago, but it was during COVID, so let's say 4 or 5 years ago. But what I found out was that it was about propensity to get one of those neurodegenerative diseases, and they had category A, category B, and category C, as I recall. And category A was, I can't quite remember. Let's say 50% of all people who had one of those diseases had these mutations, and they were in category A. Category B was 30%. Category C was 20%. Unfortunately, I was in none of the categories. But what I found out was that they add to those categories all the time. There's always new discoveries or new research. So if someone goes along and gets the genetic testing 5 years ago, how often does an individual need to keep updating those genetic tests to capture all the new data that's being gathered by people like you, for example, over time, because you start to improve the depth of your system's knowledge based on bigger populations?
Yeah. So I think the research community of genomics is enormous and widespread, and there are huge genomic databases around the world. And from a variant understanding point of view, so understanding how genetic variations translate to disease, our understanding is evolving literally every day. Because if you think about the history of genetics, really prior to 2014, we only ever were offering a genetic test to someone who already had a problem. We haven't looked at the 96% of the population who are currently healthy. So how can we translate without too much bias what it means for a healthy person to have a variation today in terms of their prospective risks in the future? And so I'm totally avoiding answering your question directly because it's hard to know. But at Eugene, we believe that there is a concept that there are points in time in your life where genetic tests are relevant. And in order to minimize harm when it comes to genetic testing, the person kind of needs to be ready for those results. And so, as an example, we have now the ability to support a person through their pregnancy planning and then use that DNA sequence again, reinterrogate it. But rather than looking at the genes that healthy people can carry but may increase the risk of health conditions in a child, we can then look at the genes associated with perhaps cancer or heart disease. And we can say, okay, today, what is the chance that you carry a known pathogenic variant that we can then change or modify your surveillance for health risks and ultimately, hopefully, reduce the incidence of diagnosis? Because our understanding is changing all the time, it may be relevant to test if you learn new information about yourself or a family member. So, as an example, maybe to finish off with a nice little sort of a case study, we recently saw a patient who had a mixed family history of cancer. So, most notably, her sister was diagnosed with breast cancer at 47 years and years ago. Nothing was ever found. Testing was limited. It targeted one specific gene and they didn't find anything. She then lost her father following a history of benign bowel polyps and then prostate cancer, but no one ever did any genetic testing because he was getting on in age and people didn't necessarily feel that the family history or his presentation correlated with a genetic diagnosis. So when she came to us, she wasn't eligible for funded genetic testing. And we know that the wait lists for tertiary centres can go anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to see a genetic counsellor or a geneticist about a concern. But her concerns were absolutely warranted. And so we believed that she should have access to testing and counselling to understand what her health risks were. And so we saw her, and she decided to pursue a broad panel that included, 60 odd genes. And within a couple of weeks, we had a result, and we were able to disclose that result to her with genetic counselling that confirmed she had a specific change in a gene called BRCA2. People like her with a BRCA2 variation have about a 70% lifetime risk of developing breast cancer, about 15 to 20% chance of developing ovarian cancer, and an increased risk of pancreatic cancer. And all of a sudden, her family history starts to have more meaning for her. And to disclose that result to her was empowering because she had always thought, I'm worried about this, but I can't get any answers and I can't get access to funded surveillance to reduce my risk. But what that result meant for her is that she had a 7 times higher chance of developing breast cancer than someone in the general population. But she was able to be referred to a tertiary familial cancer service and a breast surgeon where she chose to pursue a prophylactic mastectomy. She was able to access medications to reduce her risk. And all of a sudden, with that knowledge, this healthy woman went from a 70% lifetime risk to a less than 3% chance, which is less than someone in the general population, because she's been able to make these proactive choices to reduce her risk. And of course, with that information comes implications for her children and her siblings. And so genetic counselling is all about that family communication of how do we translate that into what this result means for that person and improving their health outcomes, but also how do we support families to share this life-changing information with each other. So long story short, things do change over time. And, I think touching base with your healthcare professionals, whether it be a GP or a cardiologist or a breast surgeon, is really valuable because things do change over time.
That's very interesting, because I think where Australians, I'm talking about the general population, not professionals like yourself, but where we have been is, we maybe somehow have a genetic test or no one, perhaps our genetic test has been done by, looking at our family members as opposed to actual genetic tests. But, oh, no one in my family's had breast cancer. Nobody in my family's had bowel cancer. I've had a, one or two colonoscopies. no polyps there. I'm fine. I'm not going to get anything. And whereas getting a proper genetic test, that, perhaps one of the ones that you can order through Eugene Labs, may actually indicate to us that just so far we've been lucky,
Mm.
and therefore we need more surveillance, greater levels of surveillance, because Australians are a bit that way.
Yeah.
That's my just from the work I've been doing on Project 100. Australians are a little bit that way. I should be right. Well, I'm not going to get that. No one in my family ever had it before, but you don't
Yeah.
know whether you actually don't know because we don't like my grandfather and my grandmother on both parents maternal and paternal side, they didn't get genetic testing for anything. Not
Mm.
even my own parents did they get genetic testing for anything. So I think what you're doing is fantastic. And I'm going to leave it with this, but I just thought about the word I was going to say. I'm dying to have a look at your website, but I don't want to say that. I want to look at your menu. I don't want to say I'm dying to. I'm living to. Is a probably better way for me to say that.
Fantastic.
Zoe Milgrom, I loved it. The conversation, it was fantastic, and you've answered a lot of questions that
Thank
I've
you.
had. And hopefully I can remember these things, and definitely our audience is going to love this one. So, Zoe Milgram, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time and the opportunity.
You're most welcome.